The key turned in the lock with the dry, grating sound of rust giving way. Abigail pushed, her shoulder pressed against the cold metal of the wagon's strong box, but the lid refused to budge. It was the last thing. The very last thing that tied them to the life that had evaporated like a puddle in the July sun. Behind her, the wind made a low moaning sound as it swept across the plains, unimpeded until it hit the strange, long curve of the corrugated iron shell they now called home. It was a sound that had become the rhythm of her days. Duke, their shepherd, whined softly, his warm body pressed against her leg, a solid, living anchor in a world that had become thin and brittle. He nosed the box, then looked up at her with eyes that held a deep, knowing sorrow. Her mother, Martha, sat on an overturned crate just inside the gaping doorway of the structure, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken much since they'd loaded the wagon with what little Franklin, her late husband's brother, had deemed theirs. Mostly debts, he had said, his face a mask of practiced sympathy that didn't quite reach his eyes. Robert, bless his heart, was a dreamer, not a planner. Abigail gritted her teeth, shoving again. The box was Robert's, from his office. Franklin had thrust it at her as a final, almost insulting, gesture. Personal effects. I'm sure you'll want them now. It was just another lock she couldn't open, another door closed to her. Leave it, Abby. Martha's voice was quiet, raspy from the dust and the cold. It's just more ghosts, but Abigail couldn't. It felt like a surrender. She had surrendered the farm, the house her hands had helped build, the very soil that held her husband. She would not surrender this last, small mystery. With a grunt, she gave up on the key and walked to the pile of scrap they'd collected from the far end of the long barn. She returned with a length of rusted rebar, wedging the tip into the seam. She put her weight on it. The metal screamed in protest. Duke barked once, a sharp, anxious sound. The lock popped, the lid springing open a few inches with a final, sighing groan. Abigail's breath hitched. She paused, the rebar still in her hand, suddenly afraid of what she might find. Or what she might not. Inside, there was no treasure. Just as Franklin had likely known. There were ledgers filled with Robert's looping, optimistic script, account books where the outgoing numbers were always starker than the incoming. There were deeds for land that had been sold off piece by piece to cover loans she never knew he had. And at the very bottom, beneath a bundle of her own letters to him from before they were married, was the deed to this place. 10 acres of useless scrubland and this bizarre iron building, an abandoned relic from some failed railroad enterprise a decade prior. It was all that was left. It was listed on the county books as the unimproved and non-arables worthless. She remembered the smirks in town when they'd passed through, their wagon piled high, heading for the old iron shell on the edge of the territories. She'd heard a man laugh. Heard the widow was moving into the tin can. She picked up the deed. The paper was dry and official. Robert had bought it 5 years ago. Why? What had this dreamer been dreaming of out here? She sank back on her heels, the cold of the packed earth seeping through her trousers. She felt a wet nose nudge her hand, and then Duke rested his heavy head in her lap. She looked from the dog to her mother, whose face was a roadmap of quiet endurance. Well, Abigail said, her voice rough. He left us a roof. Martha's gaze was steady, meeting hers across the dusty air. And you? And Duke? That's not nothing. The wind howled again, a lonely, desolate cry against the curved metal walls. Abigail closed her eyes, leaning into the dog's warmth, and for the first time since the funeral, she allowed a single, hot tear to trace a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a roof. It was a tomb. A cold, metal tomb at the end of the world. And she had to find a way to live in it. The thought was so absurd, so bleak, that a dry, ragged laugh escaped her lips. Duke lifted his head, confused. Martha simply watched her, a flicker of something, not pity, but understanding, in her tired eyes. That night, the cold was a physical presence. It pressed in from all sides, a constant, heavy weight against the thin barrier of corrugated steel. They had managed to clear a small section at one end of the vast, cavernous space, sweeping away a decade of dust, animal droppings, and the skeletal remains of forgotten nests. Abigail had used old canvas from the wagon to create a partition, a room within a room, a feeble attempt to hoard the warmth from the small, pot-bellied stove they'd salvaged. The stovepipe, precariously vented through a rust-eaten hole in the wall, glowed a dull, cherry red, a tiny heart beating against the overwhelming dark. Martha slept on a cot wrapped in every blanket they owned. Abigail lay on a pallet on the floor, Duke's solid form a furnace at her back. Every gust of wind sounded like a giant's hand trying to peel the roof off. The iron creaked and groaned, a symphony of decay. She stared up into the curved darkness above her, where the faint light of the moon filtered through 100 pinprick holes of rust, a bleak and broken constellation. She thought of her bed back at the farm, the familiar heft of the quilt, the scent of lavender and old wood, the quiet breathing of her husband beside her. Grief was a physical ache in her chest, sharp and sudden. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images remained. Franklin's smooth, placid face. The auctioneer's indifferent chant. The faces of her neighbors, a mixture of pity and a quiet, unsettling relief that it wasn't them. She had held her head high through all of it. A stubborn, useless pride that left her shivering on a dirt floor in a metal tube. She rolled onto her side, facing the faint glow of the stove. What had Robert been thinking? This place wasn't a refuge, it was a joke. A cruel punchline to a life of failed ventures. He had loved her, she knew that. But his love was a grand, sweeping thing, always focused on a horizon she couldn't see, while the ground beneath their feet crumbled. He saw potential where she saw rock and thistle. He saw a future where she saw another bill to be paid. Her anger at him was a bitter taste in her mouth, mingling with the sorrow. It was an anger she felt ashamed of, a betrayal of his memory, but it was there, a hot coal in the pit of her stomach. She had trusted him. She had poured her own small inheritance into the farm, worked her fingers raw, and for what? For this. This monument to his folly. Duke stirred, letting out a low growl that wasn't directed at the wind. Abigail put a hand on his thick fur, murmuring, "It's all right, boy." Just the world falling apart. His tail gave a weak thump-thump against the pallet. His loyalty was so simple, so absolute. It was a comfort and a reproach. She had to be worthy of it. She had to be worthy of her mother's silent faith. She couldn't just lie here and let the cold and the bitterness consume her. Tomorrow she would do more than just survive the night. She would start to fight back. She didn't know how. She didn't know with what. But the decision settled in her, a small, hard kernel of resolve. She would take this ridiculous, rusted, forgotten place and she would make it a home. She would hammer and patch and scrub the ghost of Robert's failed dream out of it and build something of her own. She would live here, stubbornly, defiantly, until the smirks in town faded into reluctant respect. It was a promise made to the darkness, to the groaning metal and the memory of a man she both loved and resented. She would live. She would endure. That would be her revenge. The next morning dawned grey and unforgiving. Abigail rose before the sun, her body stiff and sore. The fire in the stove had died, and the air was frigid. She rekindled it, the small actions of survival, splitting kindling, fetching water from the creek, a balm to her churning thoughts. After a meager breakfast of hardtack and coffee, the work began. It was overwhelming. The sheer scale of the filth and decay was staggering. She started by attacking the floor. It was mostly packed earth, but in some sections, rough-hewn planks had been laid down, now warped and rotting. As she pried up a section of boards near the center of the structure, planning to level the ground beneath, Duke became agitated. He whined, pouring at a specific spot where two planks met a section of solid-looking earth. "Get on, Duke," she said, trying to nudge him away with her leg. "I've got to get this up," but he was insistent, scratching more urgently, looking back at her with a frantic intensity. He wasn't playing. He was trying to tell her something. Martha, who had been methodically cleaning old tins to use for storage, came over. "What's got into him?" "He's taken a sudden interest in demolition," Abigail said, leaning on her crowbar. But she watched the dog. He was focused, digging now with his front paws, sending dirt flying. He would dig, then stop and sniff at a narrow crack between the last plank and the dirt floor. Abigail sighed, her frustration giving way to curiosity. All right, she knelt, shooing the dog back gently. She examined the area. It looked no different from the rest of the floor. But when she pressed down on the plank Duke had been so obsessed with, it gave slightly, with a hollow echo that the others had not. Her heart gave a small, uneven thump. She worked the edge of the crowbar into the crack. It was a struggle. The wood was swollen and tight. But with a final, wrenching heave, the plank came loose. Beneath it was not more dirt. There was a dark, square hole, about 3 feet by 3 feet, and a set of rough wooden rungs descending into blackness. It was a root cellar. Or a hiding place. A wave of dizziness washed over her. For a moment, she imagined snakes, skeletons, 100 horrors. Duke, however, showed no fear. He peered into the darkness, his tail giving a low, steady wag. Martha drew in a sharp breath. Good heavens, Abigail fetched a lantern, her hands trembling slightly as she lit the wick. She lowered it into the opening. The light cast dancing shadows on stone-lined walls. It was small, no more than 8 feet deep and perhaps 10 feet square, and it was dry. The air that rose up smelled not of rot, but of dust, earth, and something else, something faint and spicy, like old herbs. But what truly made her stop, lantern held aloft, was what she saw at the bottom. Not sacks of rotting potatoes or dusty jars of preserves. Stacked neatly against the far wall were several large, sealed metal tins and a heavy, iron-strapped wooden chest. They were pristine, untouched by the damp and the passage of time. A sudden, wild hope surged through her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. Money. It had to be. A hidden stash, forgotten by whoever had built this place. A lifeline. Hold this, she said to her mother, handing her the lantern. She tested the top rung of the ladder. It was solid. She swung her legs over the edge and began to descend into the cool, dark earth, her mind racing. Every possibility felt real, every dream of rescue and relief. She had cursed this place, and it had just offered up a secret. She reached the bottom, her boots landing softly on the stone floor. Duke whined from above, a silhouette against the grey light. Abigail ran a hand over the cold metal of the nearest tin. It was heavy. Solid. Whatever was inside, it was substantial. She moved to the wooden chest, her fingers tracing the intricate ironwork of the lock. It was a formidable thing, built to protect. There was no key. Of course, there was no key. The irony was not lost on her. Another locked box. Another secret to be wrenched open. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't the ghost of her husband's failures. This was something else entirely. Something older. Something that had been waiting, patiently, in the dark. The chest was too heavy to move, its iron straps bolted to the floor of the cellar. The tins, however, were manageable. One by one, Abigail passed them up to Martha, the effort making her grunt. They were surprisingly weighty, filled with a dense, shifting material that slid inside as she tilted them. After hauling up the last of the 6 tins, she climbed out of the cellar, her clothes covered in dust and cobwebs, her heart pounding with a mixture of exertion and wild anticipation. They carried the tins to their cleared living space and set them down near the stove. Duke sniffed at them curiously, then lay down with a contented sigh, as if his work was done. The tins were sealed with wax around the lids. Abigail took a knife and carefully broke the seal on the first one, her hands clumsy with haste. She worked the lid off. It came away with a soft hiss of released pressure. She peered inside. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't gold. It wasn't silver. It was seeds. Thousands upon thousands of them. Small, dark, and perfectly uniform. She plunged her hand in, the seeds cool and smooth, flowing through her fingers like water. She pulled out a handful and stared at them. They were unlike any she had ever seen. Not corn, not wheat, not any common bean. Seeds? Martha's voice was laced with a disappointment so profound it was almost comical. All that hope, all that effort, for a tin of mysterious seeds. Abigail felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her chest. Of course. Of course, it was seeds. In a place called non-arable, the one thing they had in abundance was something they couldn't even plant. She opened another tin. More seeds, a different variety, larger and mottled brown. The third held tiny, almost black specks. The fourth, flat, pale discs. It was a treasure trove of uselessness. Well, Martha said, her voice recovering its dry, practical edge. We won't starve, as long as we fancy a diet of raw, unidentifiable legumes. Abigail didn't laugh this time. She was looking at the last item she had brought up from the cellar, something she had tucked into her pocket. It was a small, leather-bound journal, overlooked in her first scan of the dark space. It had been wedged between two of the tins. The leather was stiff but intact. The front was embossed with a single, faded initial, S. She sat down on her pallet, the tin of seeds forgotten at her feet, and opened the journal. The first page was dated 20 years prior. The handwriting was precise, methodical, the script of an educated man. October 12, 1868, it began. The foundation is laid. The iron arrives by wagon tomorrow. They think me a fool to build with steel in this wilderness, but they do not understand. Wood rots. Wood burns. What I must protect needs to outlast me. It needs to endure the fire of the sun and the ignorance of men. Abigail looked up, her eyes wide. She looked at the curved iron walls surrounding them, seeing them not as a derelict shell, but as a deliberate fortress. She began to read aloud, her voice gaining strength as the story unfolded. The journal belonged to a man named Samuel, a botanist and an immigrant from a mountainous region of Central Europe that had been ravaged by famine and war. He wrote of his life's work, crossbreeding and developing strains of plants that could thrive in the most hostile conditions, plants that required little water, that could grow in rocky, alkaline soil, and that produced nutrient-dense food. The seeds in the tins were his legacy. The culmination of decades of patient, brilliant work. He had come here, to this specific plot of a worthless land, precisely because it was worthless. It was the perfect testing ground. If his creations could grow here, they could grow anywhere. He had built the iron barn not as a home, but as a vault. A seed bank. These are not merely seeds, he wrote on one page, the script growing more passionate. They are a promise. They are the answer to a prayer a starving child makes. They are resilience, given root. I have failed to gain the patent. The men in Des Moines, they see only what is, not what could be. They called my work unnatural and my claims unsubstantiated, so I will entrust my work to the earth itself. I have hidden my children where only a patient soul will find them. Abigail's hands were shaking as she turned the pages. The journal was filled with detailed instructions. Planting depths, watering schedules, notes on how to harvest and preserve the next generation of seeds. It was a complete manual for a new kind of agriculture. It was a blueprint for survival. She looked at the tins, no longer with disappointment, but with a sense of overwhelming awe. This wasn't a joke. It was a gift. A sacred trust. Martha was silent for a long time after Abigail finished reading. The only sound was the crackle of the stove and the soft breathing of the dog. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. That man, Samuel, he was a dreamer, too. Yes, Abigail whispered, closing the journal and holding it to her chest. But he was a planner. The discovery changed the nature of their work. It was no longer a desperate scramble for shelter, but a mission. Samuel's journal became their scripture. The iron shell was no longer a tomb, but a sanctuary, a laboratory. The first task was to break ground. The soil around the barn was just as the deed described, rocky, compacted, and unforgiving. Abigail had only a spade and a mattock, and the work was brutal. Each morning, she would rise with the sun, her body aching from the day before, and attack another small square of earth. She broke the ground, cleared the rocks, and amended the soil with leaf mold she and Martha gathered from the small copse of woods at the edge of the property. It was slow, back-breaking labor. The neighbors, the few who lived within a mile or two, would sometimes ride by on their way to town. They would see her out there, a lone woman wrestling with the stubborn earth, and shake their heads. She could feel their pity, their certainty of her failure. It only fueled her. Inside the barn, Martha took charge of the seeds. Following Samuel's meticulous notes, she sorted them, tested a few for germination in small pots by the stove, and recorded their progress. Her quiet, steady presence was a constant source of strength for Abigail. They worked in a comfortable, practiced silence, each knowing their role. One evening, as Abigail soaked her blistered hands in a basin of hot water, she looked at her mother, whose face was illuminated by the lantern as she made notes in a ledger. "Do you think it will work?" Abigail asked, the question heavy with the weight of their effort. "Do you think anything will actually grow out here?" Martha looked up, her expression calm and certain. Samuel believed it would. He gave his life to that belief. "The question is not if it will grow, Abigail. The question is, do we have the faith to see it through?" They planted the first test plot in the late spring. It was a small, protected patch of land, no bigger than a wagon bed, that Abigail had spent a month preparing. They chose 3 of Samuel's hardiest varieties, following his instructions to the letter. And then, they waited. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Every day, Abigail would inspect the plot, her heart a knot of hope and fear. For 2 weeks, there was nothing. The ground remained stubbornly bare. The smirks in town felt louder in her memory. She began to doubt. Maybe Samuel was just another madman, another dreamer whose plans turned to dust. Maybe she was the fool for believing him. On the morning of the 15th day, she almost didn't look. She was tired, discouraged, the physical and emotional toll of the last few months weighing on her heavily. But Duke, as always, seemed to know. He trotted ahead of her to the plot and began sniffing at the ground, his tail giving a tentative wag. Abigail followed, her eye scanning the dark soil. And then she saw it. A tiny speck of impossible green. She dropped to her knees, her breath catching in her throat. There was another, and another. A row of tiny, determined seedlings pushing their way through the hostile earth toward the sun. They were alive. Tears streamed down her face, tears not of grief, but of a joy so fierce and profound it felt like a physical blow. She laid her hand flat on the ground beside the tiny plants, as if she could feel their life force, their stubborn, miraculous will to live. Martha came and stood beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. In that small patch of green, their entire world had shifted. It was no longer about survival. It was about creation. That night, for the first time in months, Abigail slept a deep and dreamless sleep, the groaning of the iron wall sounding less like a complaint and more like a lullaby. The seedlings grew with an astonishing vigor. They were unlike anything Abigail had ever seen. One variety produced a sprawling vine with broad, dark green leaves and a strange, gourd-like vegetable that was delicious roasted. Another grew into a tall, stalky plant that yielded a grain that could be ground into a nutty, nourishing flour. A third was a type of bean that grew in tight, hardy bushes, requiring almost no water. The small test plot flourished, an oasis of impossible life in the middle of the scrubland. Their diet, once a grim rotation of salt pork and hardtack, was transformed. They ate well, their bodies growing stronger, their spirits lighter. The work was still hard, but now it was joyful. They expanded the garden, Abigail breaking new ground with a rhythmic determination. The iron barn itself began to transform. They used salvaged lumber to build raised beds inside, creating a year-round greenhouse in one section where the sunlight streamed through a portion of the roof Abigail had painstakingly replaced with scavenged panes of glass. The community's perception began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. It began with Mr. Henderson, the proprietor of the general store in town. He had extended them a small line of credit out of what Abigail had assumed was pity. But one day, when she came in to buy salt and lamp oil, he he looked at her differently. "Heard you got something growing out at the old railroad barn," he said, his tone curious rather than dismissive. "My boy rode past, said it looked like the Garden of Eden sprung up in a scrap heap." Abigail just nodded. "The soil is better than it looks," he grunted, leaning on the counter. "My wife's been ailing. The doctor says she needs more fresh vegetables, but with the dry spell we've had, there's not much to be had." It was not a direct request, but a door being opened. "I have some extra squash," Abigail said quietly. "And some greens. I can bring some by next time I'm in." The look of gratitude on his face was a balm to a wound she hadn't realized was still so raw. The next week, she brought a basket of produce to the store. Mrs. Henderson, a frail woman with kind eyes, wept when she saw it. From then on, a quiet trade began. Abigail would bring in her strange, miraculous vegetables, and they would leave with flour, sugar, coffee, and tools. They never spoke of money. It was an exchange based on need and respect. Other townsfolk started to stop by, their excuses thin, a lost cow, asking for directions, but their curiosity was plain. They would stare at the vibrant green of the gardens, a stark contrast to their own parched fields, and leave with a quiet sense of wonder. The women who had pitied her now asked for her advice. The men who had laughed now tipped their hats. Abigail and Martha were no longer the poor widows in the tin can. They were the mysterious women who could make the desert bloom. They had earned their place not with money or status, but with dirt, sweat, and the legacy of a forgotten genius. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Abigail was turning soil for a winter crop, she saw a buggy approaching. It was fine and black, pulled by a well-groomed horse, a stark contrast to the rough wagons that usually traverse the track to their home. She shielded her eyes against the sun and felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She recognized the driver. It was Franklin. He pulled the buggy to a stop a few yards from the garden, his eyes taking in the scene with a calculated appraisal, the neat rows of flourishing plants, the smoke curling from the stovepipe, the repaired sections of the iron wall glinting in the sun. He saw not a home, but an asset. He climbed down, smoothing his coat. He had the same placid, unreadable expression he'd worn the day he'd effectively evicted them. "Abigail," he said, his voice smooth as butter. "And Martha," he nodded toward the barn, where her mother now stood in the doorway, her posture rigid. "I was in the territory on business. I heard the most remarkable rumors. Had to see for myself." "Franklin," Abigail said, her voice flat. She didn't move from her spot, leaning on her shovel, the rich earth clinging to the blade. It felt like a shield. "Say what you came to say." His gaze swept over the gardens again. "It seems my brother's last investment was not as foolish as it appeared. I must confess, I'm astonished. This land was worthless." "It still is, to most," Abigail replied. "It just requires a different kind of work." He gave a small, condescending smile. "Indeed. Well, I am here on a matter of family. As the executor of Robert's estate, which, as you know, was insolvent, any subsequent value derived from his assets technically reverts to the estate to settle outstanding debts." The words hung in the air, cold and precise. Abigail felt a surge of white-hot anger, but she held it in check. She had learned patience from the soil, from the seeds. She would not let him see her break. "There is no value here, Franklin. Only what we eat." "Oh, I think not," he said, gesturing to the bounty around them. "I've heard talk in town. People are calling this a miracle. A miracle has value. And that patent office in de Morin Samuel's journal mentioned a patent could be worth a great deal." He knew. He must have gone through Robert's papers more thoroughly than he'd let on, perhaps even read a copy of the journal himself. He had been waiting, letting her do the hard work, ready to swoop in and claim the spoils. Martha stepped out of the barn, holding an old, heavy rifle. She didn't aim it. She just held it, its presence a stark and undeniable statement. Franklin's eyes flickered toward it, his smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "Now, there's no need for that," he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "This is a legal matter. This is our home," Abigail said, her voice low and steady. She took a step forward, the shovel still in her hand. She was no longer the grieving, broken woman he had dismissed months ago. She was rooted here. Robert bought this land. The deed is in my name. The work is in my hands. The seeds were a gift from a dead man to the dirt, not to you. There is nothing for you here. He looked from her face, hard as flint, to Martha's unyielding stance in the doorway, to Duke, who had appeared at Abigail's side and was emitting a low, continuous growl from deep in his chest. He saw three immovable objects. His mask of reasonableness slipped, revealing the raw avarice beneath. You are a fool, Abigail. You are sitting on a fortune and you're content to trade it for sacks of flour. I could make us all rich. We are not hungry, Abigail said simply. We are not cold. That is a kind of wealth you wouldn't understand. The finality in her tone was absolute. There was no argument to be made, no angle left to exploit. He had come expecting to intimidate a pair of helpless women. He had found something else entirely. He stared at her for a long moment, his mind clearly calculating and coming up empty. He saw no weakness to leverage. With a frustrated sigh, he turned on his heel, his polished shoes scuffing in the dust he so disdained. You'll regret this, he spat, climbing back into his buggy. When you're old and this fantasy dries up, you'll remember this day. He snapped the reins, and the buggy lurched away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly over the vibrant green leaves of the garden. Abigail didn't watch him go. She turned and looked at her mother. Martha lowered the rifle, her face weary but resolute. He won't be back, Martha said. It wasn't a question. No, Abigail agreed. She drove the shovel into the earth. He won't. The confrontation with Franklin was a storm that passed, leaving the air clean and clear. His departure marked the end of the last tie to their old life of debt and sorrow. They were truly free. The peace that settled over the iron barn in the following months was a profound and earned thing. It was in the quiet rhythm of their days, rising with the sun, the shared work in the gardens, the evenings spent reading by the light of the stove. The community, once a source of judgment, had become a quiet network of allies. The man whose wife's health had been restored by their vegetables repaired their leaky roof with new sheets of tin. The blacksmith, in exchange for a steady supply of a particular hardy grain his horses loved, forged new, stronger tools for Abigail. They were no longer on the outside looking in, they were a vital, if eccentric, part of the whole. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the world in a blanket of white, Abigail sat with Martha, Samuel's journal open on her lap. They had come to the passage about Des Moines, the one Franklin had thrown in her face. The men in Des Moines, they see only what is, not what could be. We should go, Abigail said, breaking the silence. Martha looked up from her mending. Go? To Des Moines? What for? For Samuel, Abigail said, tapping the page. He was right. They didn't see it then. But maybe they would now. She looked around the warm, sheltered space they had created. They had more than enough food stored for the winter. They had saved thousands of new seeds from the harvest, carefully catalogued in tins just as Samuel had done. They had proof. Tangible, edible proof of his genius. His work shouldn't die with us, Abigail continued. He wanted it to feed people. Starving people. He called them a promise. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her needle still. It's a long journey. And a cold one. We'll go in the spring, Abigail said. We'll take the wagon. We'll take the seeds, the ledgers, the vegetables. We'll show them what can be. It was a daunting idea. Two women, traveling hundreds of miles to petition a government office that had already dismissed the idea once. It was another of Robert's impossible dreams, perhaps. But it felt different. This dream was rooted in the earth. They had the evidence in their hands. It wasn't about getting rich, as Franklin had imagined. It was about honoring the legacy they had been given. It was about spreading the resilience that had saved them. All right, Martha said, a slow smile spreading across her face. But you're driving. My bones are too old for that much jostling. A year later, the iron barn was almost unrecognizable. The rust had been scrubbed away from the front and replaced with a coat of protective paint, paid for with the sale of their surplus harvest. A sturdy porch, built by the town carpenter, ran along the front, and on it, in the golden light of a late summer evening, sat Abigail and Martha. The gardens had doubled in size, a patchwork quilt of greens, yellows, and deep purples, stretching out from the barn in neat, thriving rows. People now came from 2 counties away, not for charity, but to buy Samuel's seeds. The trip to Des Moines had been a quiet triumph. They hadn't been met with a parade or a grand ceremony. Instead, they had found a single, thoughtful clerk in the patent office, a young man with an interest in agronomy. He had listened patiently, examined their evidence, the dried vegetables that had survived the journey, the bags of grain, Samuel's meticulous journal, and his skepticism had slowly turned to wonder. The patent was not granted in Samuel's name, the laws were too complex for that, but the Department of Agriculture agreed to fund a pilot program, distributing the seeds to homesteaders in the driest, most difficult territories. Samuel's promise was finally being kept. Abigail looked out at the land, her land. A hawk circled high overhead in the vast blue sky. Duke lay at her feet, his head on his paws, now an old dog, his muzzle grey. She thought of the woman who had arrived here, filled with a grief and rage so profound she could barely breathe. She had seen only a rusted shell, an emblem of failure. She hadn't seen the secret it held. She hadn't understood that the most resilient things are often forged in the harshest conditions. The iron had endured. The seeds had endured. And so had they. Martha reached over and placed her wrinkled hand over Abigail's. Her touch was light, familiar, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through and everything they had become. "It's a good life, Abby," she said softly. Abigail looked at her mother's face, etched with the wisdom of her years, and then at the impossible garden blooming in the dust. The scent of warm earth and growing things filled the air. "Yes, Mama," she said, her voice full. It is the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of rose and gold. The light caught the metal of the barn, making it glow like a beacon. It wasn't a tomb or a scrap heap. It was a home. It was a legacy. It was a testament to the simple, stubborn, and quietly triumphant act of putting down roots and refusing to break.